And now you can reopen your microphone and camera. Perfect. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Teresa, and thanks everyone for joining today's crash course. My name is David Pfeffer. I'm from ETH Zurich, and I will give the first part of this crash course and then hand over to the representatives from the DICE project. So just to give you a short recap of what we are doing in the INCREASE project. So the goal of the INCREASE project is to increase the use of recycled plastic content in electronic applications. And at the heart of this project, there are 5 business cases with very different requirements for their plastics. And we have been trying over the last 3 years to come up with different sourcing, sorting, recycling technologies to produce recyclates that meet the end applications demands. And there have been various different partners involved in the project from different steps in the value chain. And today we are an actor that has focused more on the systemic perspective. So looking across different steps of the value chain, how is the policy and regulatory landscape looking like for plastics recycling and the use of recycled content in electronics? So I can start with a little motivation to understand, okay, why is it complicated, or what are the different complications when designing policies for circular plastics at the EU level? And one thing that comes up is that these policies have to often balance between different objectives that are actually already formulated in different EU strategies. So on the one hand, we have the Circular Economy Action Plan, where we want to increase circularity of plastics, of electronic devices, etc., and also enhance the sustainability of products in more general. And then there is also the industrial strategy that has become more prominent, of course, now in the last 2 years, to increase the resilience of the EU market and also boost and foster innovation. And then thirdly, there is another important strategy that is the chemical strategy, where the EU aims to transition towards zero pollution and a toxic-free environment. So any policies that are designed for circular economy always need to try to balance between these 3 objectives that can sometimes create some tensions. Related to that, there are also different types of legislations that are along the value chain that are covered. And these are typically chemical legislations that cover substances, such as the EU REACH, the POP regulation, or the CLP. And then there are often product legislations that target the end product, for example, the product safety regulations or the eco-design regulation. And then lastly, traditionally, there was another category, the waste legislation, where we defined when a product has become waste, what should we do with it? Can we ship it? Can we not ship it? And things like this. But this distinction between these 3 categories in a circular economy will become more and more or less and less strong. So there's more and more interactions and overlaps between these 3. What we wanted to do during the INCREASE project is to first understand, for our case, of recycling plastics and using more recycled content in electronics. So what are the key policy instruments right now at the EU that affect this process? Then we also wanted to understand, having these instruments, how well do they play together? And lastly, what are the key gaps in this current policy landscape? To do so, we used qualitative tools. So we first analyzed these regulations in more depth, like highlighting the different parts that really affect recycling and recycle uptake, and also the actors that they make prescriptions to come up with some inventory of policy instruments at the EU. And you can see here a little screenshot of that just to showcase how this looks like. And then secondly, we conducted several interviews with different experts. Firstly, experts in the value chain from the industry that cover different steps of the processes. and then also with policymakers to give also a more in-depth or systemic overview. And yeah, so to give you already some of the key findings that we took out from this work that we conducted. First of all, when we look at the main policy landscapes for plastics in electronics, we can see that there are several very important legislations. One of them, one of these blockers, of course, this waste management legislation, focusing in particularly on the WE directive, and then also waste shipment regulations. And then we also identified many important product legislations, and particularly now the upcoming eco design for sustainable products, or the RoHS directive that will play an important role. In addition, we also see that there are regulations that are not directly coming from electronics. For example, the packaging and packaging waste regulation or the single-use plastics directive that have very important rules, for example, on mass balance, that define these rules the first time in these regulations, and that could become an important template also used for electronics later. This is, of course, not sure, but it's usually in these sectors where these rules have been defined first. And maybe secondly, something I already touched upon before, the distinction between regulations focusing on waste and regulation focusing on products is less and less strong. So with more recent legislations like packaging and packaging waste regulation, we see that there are mandates on how new packaging products should be designed, but also prescriptions on how the waste of packaging should be treated. Then we also try to look a bit more into what is now in this big legal texts, and we wanted to classify what type of instruments does the EU currently use to stimulate recycling, but also to incentivize the uptake of recycled content. And for that, we first of all try to classify these instruments into different purposes. So on the one hand, we have so-called supply push policies and instruments that try to increase the supply of recyclates in the market. And an example of this are collection targets, recovery targets, as specified in the WEEE directive, but also disposal bans of separately collected waste. Then on the other side, there are some policies that try to pull the demand pull policies that try to stimulate the uptake of recyclates. And examples that are right now existing in the policy mix in the EU are public procurement guidelines, product labeling, and recycled content quota. These, however, the last ones, they do not exist for electronics, but they have been specified now for packaging and also in the new end-of-life vehicle regulation. And then the last type of instrument category we define as life cycle safety and traceability instruments. So these try that the entire process is traceable, and that also in the end the safety of the final output is ensured along the entire life cycle. And examples for these instruments are the substance restrictions for hazardous substances specified in the REACH regulation, in the POP regulation, or the RoHS. And for an example for traceability rules are any mass balance calculation rules. Additionally, to the different purposes of instruments, there are also different types of instruments that can be classified into economic instruments. So really trying to use prices as a way to change behavior. An example for this is an incineration tax, as it exists in the Netherlands, for example. It's a virgin plastic tax, as it has been introduced in Spain for packaging, or the EU ETS system. So it's not like a strict rule, but it's trying to make behavior change through prices. And then there are, of course, also, let's say, more strict regulatory instruments that impose behavior directly via rules. And an example for this are chemical substance restrictions in the REACH and other chemical regulations, and then also export and import bans of waste. And then lastly, there are more softer instruments, so-called information instruments, such as product labeling or information campaigns. Yeah, so this was a short overview and classification of how the EU landscape looks like for plastics recycling. Now we give you a short glimpse of two of the main findings that we see where things are still providing some barriers to increase the recycling and the use of recyclates in the EU. One of these results is that the interface between waste, product, and chemical legislation still needs to be further improved. So on the one hand, we have chemical and product legislation that typically has the aim to ensure the safety of the electronic products and its substances. And then we have circular economy targets and waste legislation that tries to promote recycling and the use of recyclates. So right now they can stand a bit in conflict, but what the EU is trying and what I think has to be even more improved is to refine tools to improve this interface. One of example is the already existing databases at the EU. There is, for example, already the so-called SKIP database that tries to map hazardous substances in new electronic products. But we saw from interviews and also other studies that this database has not really been used a lot, neither from producers nor from recyclers. So apparently it does not really fit to the daily needs that recycling and sorting companies could make it work. And also it looks like there is not the right type of enforcement to use these tools because they're not as comprehensively used so far. And secondly, another promising tool is the digital product passport. And here we also found from the interviews that the data that has been collected in this product passport can be a very vital tool for improving recycling and better knowing the input composition of products, but that the data that is being collected now often does not fit, again, the daily routine, the daily work of the recycling and sorting companies. For example, as it's a lot of the information is stored in a QR code that is usually first shredded when material arrives. So we see here a lot still room for potential to really use all this potential of this new digital product passport to make it also been used and applied more in the recycling and sorting. Then another point to improve the interface between chemical and waste legislation is the eco design for sustainable products regulation and the extended producer responsibility. And here there is now a very important tool for policymakers to emphasize recyclability and hazardous waste generation as a key indicator for product sustainability. And we will expect now in the next years delegated acts to be introduced for different types of products. So this is something to look out for and to see how products can be made more recyclable and to be using less hazardous materials that can also does not hinder the recyclability at the end of this life. And this can also be very nicely connected with extended producer responsibility schemes, for example, via fee modulation, so to adjust fees that actually cover cost of removal of hazardous substances, or to adjust fees based on the recyclability of the products. A second finding from our study was when we looked at all the instruments that are out there, we saw that there is relatively little focus so far on the demand side. So there are a lot of instruments focusing on the recycling steps, but not so much on actually stimulating the uptake of recyclates or the disincentivizing the use of virgin material. So here, right now, there's more and more policy discussion happening. So at the global level, there has been the UN Plastic Treaty negotiations that have not come to a conclusion, but the focus here was very strongly on demand side measures. So we can expect this to be increasingly discussed also now at the EU level. And secondly, the eco design for sustainability regulation was the first regulation to put really great emphasis on product sustainability and on the production side, and also the option to increase recycled content targets for electronics via delegated acts. So this is something that could be, is worth looking out for in the future. And then, apart from the demand side, we saw that in the entire life cycle, there are very few economic instruments that try to either incentivize the use of recyclates and recycling or disincentivize the, let's say, the alternatives. And again, we see there's some more recent policy discussions on these kind of economic instruments. One example are plastic taxes for packaging that have been introduced in Spain or the UK. That's still very recent, so I think it's very interesting to see how it works and how it actually changes behavior, and also it affects the companies. And then another example are any discussions on VAT reductions for recycled or reused products to kind of address directly the consumption stage. So these are two examples, but there are many more to discuss on the economic side. Yeah, this has been our short introduction, a short update of what we've been doing on trying to map the policy landscapes and see how well it works right now and where there are some gaps. We can, we advise it if you're interested. I put here a couple of links, so we will share the slides so you can check them out. I think definitely it's worth checking out the evaluation of the WEEE directive, which will be revised. So I think this evaluation can already give a nice insights on how the WEEE directive could change in the future, how the targets could be revised. Then it's also always important to keep an eye on the implementing acts and decisions and calls for feedbacks from the Single-Use Plastics Directive and from the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, because we will expect in 2026, the EU has announced to introduce further rules to how to calculate recycled content in this regulation. So I think this will be a very, very important decision. So yeah, keep an eye on it. And then lastly, it's also worthwhile to check out this study from the Commission from the EU with some partners already also from the project, as it has a lot of public information on electronics and recycled content targets. So that's very worth checking out. Yeah, and if you are also interested in our work, we have published one research article. Feel free to check it out. I put the link here as well. That was my part. And if you have any questions, we will first go directly to the presentation of the DICE project, but feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to already answer some of them. Then I'll hand over the word to Sonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Very interesting presentation. Building on what you just presented, I would like to now invite the audience to have a closer look at the medical devices value chain. And as you may be aware, this is a sector that uses many types of plastics and holds strong potential for circular solutions. So these solutions are being developed and tested through the Digital Health in the Circular Economy project that is also on Horizon, a European funded project. And we are working within this on policy recommendations. So this is the linkage on the topic of the training today. But before we dive into these details, into the regulatory aspects, I would like to invite us to see the video, a short DICE video introducing the project. Please.
The use of digital healthcare technologies, such as wearable biosensors, has increased rapidly in recent years.
Innovation in healthcare has enabled great progress, but this progress has increased the generation of electronic waste, so-called e-waste.
E-waste from digital health devices is complex because of the added challenge of potential biological and chemical contamination. And these devices are usually incinerated or disposed of in landfill.
This means a loss of valuable materials such as lithium, titanium and other metals and plastics, which are increasingly in demand for producing new electronic devices and other products.
The DICE project has been created to address these challenges, and it aims to extend the lifetime of digital healthcare devices by developing and piloting solutions across the whole product lifecycle.
DICE uses 6 products as case studies: an endo cutter used in hospitals for stapling in surgery, an ECG lead set, digital display label, an on-body drug delivery system, a smart pill box, and a medical sensor used by patients at home.
The project examines and develops circular design processes, including strategies to enable maximum use life of the product and maximize the recovery of the materials when the product can no longer be used.
The project is also developing motivational strategies to optimize the collection of these devices, working with citizens and healthcare professionals to understand what motivates them to handle and dispose of end-of-use devices correctly.
These innovations will be tested and demonstrated in 3 European healthcare ecosystems through community-engaged pilots.
The result of DICE will be a replicable model for healthcare, as well as adjacent industries, that enables moving away from a fragmented and linear take, make, waste business model towards a circular and sustainable one, allowing the reuse of products and recovery of components and raw materials.
To stay up to date with its progress and results, register as a DICE stakeholder. The use of
Thank you. And with this brief introduction, I would like to dive into the medical devices regulation and 2 others that are selected for this training today. And in particular now, the MDR, this is the acronym used, issued in 2017, provides guidance and requirements specifically on one circular action that is reprocessing. Of course, reprocessing also covers, when we get into the details, covers sterilization, decontamination, other steps that could improve the circularity of products. So our finding there, following an assessment in the European region, is that although we have this European directive in place, the adoption of this national regulation is up to the countries in terms of timelines. Some take longer than others, sometimes also in terms of the content, because there are light deviations that we have seen in the national regulations. So this leads us to, as you can see in the map, in the illustration, to a scattered implementation. There, for example, the countries that are in color green mean that you have already adopted the MDR regulation and are authorizing the reprocessing, while the ones in red not yet, or have decided not to do that, and the ones in yellow are in the consultation process. This is an update as of June, July this year. We check this situation regularly to see if there are some changes. So this scatter implementation, as you can understand, impacts on a non-smooth implementation of some circular options. So the next slide gets a bit more into detailed aspects on what are the consequences of this, and or what are the reasons for this situation. I would like to highlight in particular 2 or 3 of them. In the same way that we have the European directive, that is the MDR, medical devices regulation, there is in other markets, for other markets, also well-established regulations, such as in the USA, the FDA regulation. And for these very international value chains that are the medical devices, of course, the ideal situation would be that they are compatible. But actually, in some parts, there are some inconsistencies. And this is something that has been highlighted during our consultation processes. Another aspect is about the particular step that is needed for medical devices to be present in the market in Europe to acquire the CE mark. That is a process that, according to the actors and then also producers, manufacturers, and notification bodies has become very cumbersome. So it doesn't make the market very agile, and this is nowadays seen as a barrier to upscale more, in that case, introduction in the market of reprocessed devices. We should hold the same, should also be adopting the CE mark similar to any new product. These are two aspects. Of course, there are others, but that would make the situation or the upscaling, the dissemination of the circular action of reprocessing a bit easier to implement in the region. In the next slide, what we can see is another upcoming very important act or regulation, that is the Circular Economy Act. You may have seen that there is a draft published by the European Commission, which is now in place and is requiring feedback from key actors. We are among them collecting facts, feedback, evidence in order to respond to this call, which is due in November 6th. And in this Circular Economy Act, this is a short text, there are elements established for what would become the full-fledged directive. Some highlights of this Circular Economy Act is the baseline, which is aims to be very consistent with existing regulations, like the Waste Framework Directive, the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, the Packaging Waste Regulation and Waste Regulation. Some of them were mentioned by David. Also, another important aspect is the focus that will be initially on WE. This is the proposal, so on electronic waste. And the third element is the mix of interventions. Some of them also were explained in the first part of this session today, about the different mechanisms that would enforce the circular economy in Europe. So one element also that is interesting to mention is the need to properly address the export of waste and secondary raw materials. So what does it mean? It's not clearly said yet, but this is something that is aimed to be tackled within the draft Circular Economy Act. The next one, please. And from our initial consultation internally in DICE, we have collected a couple of some insights on what we see as points for discussion to be raised in response to this call for feedback. One is the limited focus on the full set of possibilities within a circular economy. The focus is too much on recycling, which is one part of it's downstream, but it's not covering the full potential of circular economy in the actions proposed. The other point is it's not clear the definition of the circular economy indicator used, which is the circular material use rate. So there needs to be more clarity on that, why this indicator was selected, what does it mean, at what level, micro, macro, etc. So there are several questions around this, and we believe this shouldn't be the only one, but okay, this is to be finalized again within our consortium before we submit our feedback. The other point is that the set of actions related to increasing awareness, capacities in within the population and economic actors is not addressed, is not covered. And this is extremely important if we want to upscale measures or improve the circularity. So another aspect related to that is the infrastructure. So yes, a number of measures can be implemented, but what about the resources and infrastructure needed to put in place some technical developments, for example, research needed. So this is also lacking in the current draft. And at last, one of the points, high-level points, is the social sustainability, which is not considered in the draft Circular Economy Act, which should be, as we know, this is more and more important when we see that downstream and upstream social impacts result from the waste management activities, if not properly done. And with this, we have another mandatory set of mechanisms related to the next slide, please. Waste. And there, please, Else, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonia, and thanks for that good introduction. Yes, I think waste is a very big topic in the EU because we want to increase resiliency, but of course, in order for us to create that closer loop or closed loop even, we also need to look at how waste is currently being classified and what the current challenges are that we're facing today. So as said before, in EU, we have one governing framework, which is the waste shipments regulation. And basically, in a nutshell, what happens there is that there's 3 ways of classifying waste through a color coding system. If you like, the green list is most non-hazardous materials, which require no controls whatsoever to be moved from one place to another. We have also amber lists, which are also known as notification controls, where you need quite a due diligence to be processed before you can actually ship materials from one country to the other. And then finally, we also have a rest list. I'll come back to the amber list process in a second, and will at least clarify why transboundary shipments in the EU of notification controlled waste is extremely challenging for companies and for scalability across different sectors throughout the EU and beyond the EU. Before we can actually do a shipment, we also need to clarify clearly what the waste is that we are shipping. And so to that end, we have to use the European Waste Code classification, where the actual classification is on the responsibility of the one handling the shipment itself. So there is some decision trees that are made available to come to a conclusion, but the responsibility is on the shipper and is not classified by the authorities. This is quite challenging because when we do actual shipments, and you'll see that later in the flow, any country that is involved in the shipment process can challenge your classification. So within the different member state, that means that there may be different ways of understanding the classification, and you may be challenged on each and every one of them. So that again poses problems in moving from one member state to the other. Additionally, when we move from the EU, for example, to Switzerland, we are governed by an additional law, which is called the Basel Convention. And while the waste shipment regulation is more or less aligned, it's not a one-on-one translation. So you need to repeat that assessment also to align with that as well. And to compound this even further, when you then move beyond the EU, we also see that the Basel Convention is not ratified by all countries worldwide. So then there's additional rulings that come into play that are determined by the OECD. So with that, you see an extremely fragmented landscape, which does not really incentivize anyone really to pursue any transboundary movements of goods once they appear on the amber list, let's say. And just to illustrate a little bit more, if we go to the next slide, you'll see how that actually works and why it is so challenging. So basically what happens if you have all the permits in place for the facility to receive certain materials, and you would like to start moving a good that is on the amber list, basically a recycler and a country waste handler will start initiating the document preparation. So they will set up the whole dossier that contains elements on what is the purpose, why is it moving between the member states. For example, this could be because there's a lack of infrastructure within that country, which is justifying the use of moving it elsewhere. And that is very, very good indeed, because we did see rather unsavory practices in the past where shipments of waste that were, let's say, say, on an amber list ended up being dumped elsewhere and were not properly contained. So from an environmental perspective, this is absolutely a good thing, but it also requires a lot of documentation process along the way. When you have finalized your dossier, you have to provide this to both the exporting country, the importing country, and all the transit countries in between. So if you have quite an extensive route, let's say you are moving from Ireland through France to Switzerland, for example, that is the 3 countries that are already involved, and each of them can then challenge the documentation that you provide and can challenge the waste classification that you have. So until all 3 have approved the documentation, there's nothing you can do. And you have to wait for that process to terminate before you can even start thinking about doing your first shipment. In total, we have had experience throughout the industry that this process takes up to 9 to 12 months. And in some cases, you need to renew your dossier after 1 year. So that effectively means that after your approval, you immediately start working again on the new approval dossier, because otherwise you run into gaps in between the different approval systems. So this is where I think also the shaping of the Circular Economy Act, whilst focused on e-waste, also could help in addressing other waste as well, where there's a clear indication or a strategic choice from the Commission to move towards a single market for these types of waste. And while the rules and the guidance on, let's say, protecting the environment should still be in place, at least there's room for simplification and going, for example, towards a unified portal where you can submit, instead of one member state by member state, across the EU, for example, to facilitate that process. Also, the lack of harmonization, let's say, on the understanding of the waste code classifications is something where we would also like to see more harmonized guidance and harmonized assessment, let's say, of the waste codes as such. So then if we move, I think we have reached the end of the official presentation. I'll turn it back to David.
Thank you. Now I'm unmuted. Thanks for all your attention, and